Job. Job and the Patriarchs. Job's wealth and benefactions. Satan and Job. Job's suffering. The four friends. Job restored. Job. Job and the Patriarchs. Job, the most pious Gentile that ever lived. One of the few to bear the title of honor, the servant of Elohim, was of double kin to Jacob. He was a grandson of Jacob's brother Esau, and at the same time the son-in-law of Jacob himself, for he had married Dinah as his second wife. He was entirely worthy of being a member of the Patriarch's family, for he was perfectly upright, one that feared Elohim, and eschewed evil. Had he not wavered in his resignation to the divine will during the great trial to which he was subjected and murmured against Yahuwah, the distinction would have been conferred upon him of having his name joined to the name of Yahuwah in prayer, and men would have called upon the Elohim of Job as they now call upon the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he was not found steadfast like the three fathers, and he forfeited the honor Elohim had intended for him. Yahuwah remonstrated with him for his lack of patience, saying, Why didst thou murmur when suffering came upon thee? Dost thou think thyself of greater worth than Adam, the creation of mine own hands, upon whom together with his descendants I decreed death on account of a single transgression? And yet Adam murmured not. Thou art surely not more worthy than Abraham, whom I tempted with many trials. And when he asked, Whereby shall I know that I shall inherit the land? And I replied, Know of a surety that thy seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. He yet murmured not. Thou dost not esteem thyself more worthy than Moses, dost thou? Him I would not grant the favor of entering the promised land, because he spake the words, Hear now, ye rebels, shall we bring you forth water out of this rock? And yet he murmured not. Art thou more worthy than Aaron, unto whom I showed greater honor than unto any created being? For I sent the angels themselves out of the Holy of Holies when he entered the place. Yet when his two sons died, he murmured not. The contrast between Job and the patriarchs appears from words spoken by him and words spoken by Abraham. Addressing Elohim, Abraham said, That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, that so the righteous should be as the wicked? And Job exclaimed against Elohim, It is all one. Therefore I say, he destroyed the perfect and the wicked. They both received their due recompense. Abraham was rewarded and Job was punished. Convinced that his suffering was undeserved and unjust, Job had the audacity to say to Elohim, O Yahuwah of the world, thou didst create the ox with cloven feet and the ass with unparted hoof. Thou hast created paradise and hell. Thou createst the righteous and also the wicked. There is none to hinder. Thou canst do as seemeth good in thy sight. The friends Job replied, It is true, Elohim hath created the evil inclination, but he hath also given man the Torah as a remedy against it. Therefore the wicked cannot roll their guilt from off their shoulders and put it up on Elohim. The reason Job did not shrink from such extravagant utterances was because he denied the resurrection of the dead. He judged of the prosperity of the wicked and the woes of the pious only by their earthly fortunes. Proceeding from this false premise, he held it to be possible that the punishment fallen to his share was not at all intended for him. Elohim had slipped into an error. He imposed the suffering upon him that had been appointed unto a sinner. But Yahuwah spake to him, saying, Many hairs have I created upon the head of man, yet each hair hath its own sack. For were two hairs to draw their nourishment from the same sack, man would lose the sight of his eyes. It hath never happened that a sack hath been misplaced. Should I then have mistaken Job for another? I let many drops of rain descend from the heavens, and for each drop there is a mold in the clouds. For were two drops to issue from the same mold, the ground would be made so miry that it could not bring forth any growth. It hath never happened that a mold hath been misplaced. Should I then have mistaken Job for another? Many thunderbolts are hurled from the skies, but each one comes from its own path. For were two to proceed from the same path, they would destroy the whole world. It had never happened that a path had been misplaced. Should I then have mistaken Job for another? The gazelle gives birth to her young on the topmost point of a rock, and it would fall into the abyss and be crushed to death, if I did not send an eagle thither to catch it up and carry it to its mother. Were the eagle to appear a minute earlier or later than the appointed time, the little gazelle would perish. It had never happened that the proper minute of time was missed. Should I then have mistaken Job for another? The hind has a contracted womb and would not be able to bring forth her young if I did not send a dragon to her at the right second to nibble at her wound and soften it, for then she can bear. Were the dragon to come a second before or after the right time, the hind would perish. It had never happened that I missed the right second. Should I then have mistaken Job for another? Notwithstanding Job's unpardonable words, Elohim was displeased with his friends for passing harsh judgment upon him. A man may not be held responsible for what he does in his anguish, and Job's agony was great indeed. Job's wealth and benefactions. Job was asked once what he considered the severest affliction that could strike him, and he replied, "My enemies joy in my misfortune." And when Elohim demanded to know of him, after the accusations made by Satan, what he preferred, poverty or physical suffering, he chose pain, saying, "O Yahuwah of the whole world, chastise my body with suffering of all kinds. Only preserve me from poverty." Poverty seemed the greater scourge, because before his trials he had occupied a brilliant position on account of his vast wealth. Elohim graciously granted him this foretaste of the Messianic time. The harvest followed close upon the plowing of his field. No sooner were the seeds strewn in the furrows than they sprouted and grew and ripened, produced. He was equally successful with his cattle. His sheep killed wolves, but were themselves never harmed by wild beasts. Of sheep he had no less than 130,000, and he required 800 dogs to keep guard over them, not to mention the 200 dogs needed to secure the safety of his house. Besides, his herds consisted of 350,000 asses and 3,500 pairs of oxen. All these possessions were not used for self-indulgent pleasures, but for the good of the poor and the needy, whom he clothed and fed and provided with all things necessary. To do all this, he even had to employ ships that carried supplies to all the cities and the dwelling places of the destitute. His house was furnished with doors on all its four sides, that the poor and the wayfarer might enter, no matter from what direction they approached. At all times there were 30 tables laden with viands ready in his house, and 12 besides for widows only, so that all who came found what they desired. Job's consideration for the poor was so delicate that he kept servants to wait upon them constantly. His guests, enraptured by his charitableness, frequently offered themselves as attendants to minister to the poor in his house. But Job always insisted upon paying them for their services. If he was asked for a loan of money to be used for business purposes, and the borrower promised to give a part of his profits to the poor, he would demand no security beyond a mere signature. And if it happened that by some mischance or other the debtor was not able to discharge his obligation, Job would return the note to him or tear it into bits in his presence. He did not rest satisfied at supplying the material needs of those who applied to him. He strove also to convey the knowledge of Elohim to them. After a meal, he was in the habit of having music played upon instruments, and then he would invite those present to join him in songs of praise to Elohim. On such occasions, he did not consider himself above playing the citron while the musicians rested. Most particularly, Job concerned himself about the weal and woe of widows and orphans. He was wont to pay visits to the sick, both rich and poor, and when it was necessary, he would bring a physician along with him. If the case turned out to be hopeless, he would sustain the stricken family with advice and consolation. When his wife of the incurably sick man began to grieve and weep, he would encourage her with such words as these: "Trust always in the grace and loving kindness of Elohim. He hath not abandoned thee until now, and he will not forsake thee henceforth. Thy husband will be restored to health, and will be able to provide for his family as heretofore. But if, which may Elohim forfend, thy husband should die, I call heaven to witness that I shall provide substance for thee and thy children." Having spoken thus, he would send for a notary and have him draw up a document which he signed in the presence of witnesses, binding himself to care for the family, should it be bereaved of its head. Thus he earned for himself the blessing of the sick man and the gratitude of the sorrowing wife. Sometimes, in case of necessity, Job could be severe, too, especially when it was a question of helping a poor man obtain his due. If one of the parties to a suit cited before his tribunal was known to be a man of violence, he would surround himself with his army and inspire him with fear, so that the culprit could not but show himself amenable to his decision. He endeavored to inculcate his benevolent ways upon his children by accustoming them to wait upon the poor. On the morrow, after a feast, he would sacrifice bountifully to Elohim, and together with the pieces upon the altar his offerings would be divided among the needy. He would say, "Take and help yourselves, and pray for my children. It may be that they have sinned and renounced Yahuwah, saying in the presumption of their hearts, 'We are the children of this rich man. All these things are our possessions. Why should we be servants to the poor?'" Satan and Job. The happy, God-pleasing life led by Job for many years excited the hatred of Satan, who had an old grudge against him. Near Job's house there was an idol worshipped by the people. Suddenly doubts assailed the heart of Job, and he asked himself, "Is this idol really the creator of heaven and earth? How can I find out the truth about it?" In the following night he perceived a voice calling, "Jobab, Jobab, arise, and I will tell thee who he is whom thou desirest to know." This one to whom the people offer sacrifices is not God. He is the handiwork of the tempter, wherewith he deceives men. When he heard the voice, Job threw himself on the ground and said, "O Yahuwah, if this idol is the handiwork of the tempter, then grant that I may destroy it. None can hinder me, for I am the king of this land." Job, or as he is sometimes called, Jobab, was indeed king of Edom, the land wherein wicked plans are concocted against Elohim. Wherefore it is called also Uz, capital U-Z, council. The voice continued to speak. It made itself known as that of an archangel of Elohim, and revealed to Job that he would bring down the enmity of Satan upon himself by the destruction of the idol, and much suffering with it. However, if he remained steadfast under them, Elohim would change his troubles into joys. His name would become celebrated throughout the generations of mankind, and he would have a share in the resurrection to eternal life. Job replied to the voice, "Out of love of Elohim, I am ready to endure all things unto the day of my death. I will shrink back from naught." Now Job arose, and accompanied by 50 men, he repaired to the idol and destroyed it. Knowing that Satan would try to approach him, he ordered his guard not to give access to anyone, and then he withdrew to his chamber. He had guessed aright. Satan appeared at once in the guise of a beggar, and demanded speech with Job. The guard executed his orders and forbade his entering. Then the mendicant asked him to intercede for him with Job for a piece of bread. Job knew it was Satan, and he sent word to him as follows: "Do not expect to eat of my bread, for it is prohibited unto thee." At the same time putting a piece of burnt bread into the hand of the guard for Satan. The servant was ashamed to give a beggar burnt bread, and he substituted a good piece for it. Satan, however, knowing that the servant had not executed his master's errand, told him so to his face. And he fetched the burnt bread and handed it to him, repeating the words of Job. Thereupon Satan returned this answer: "As the bread is burnt, so I will disfigure thy body." Job replied, "Do as thou desirest, and execute thy plan. As for me, I am ready to suffer whatever thou bringest down upon me. Now Satan betook himself to Elohim and prayed him to put Job into his power, saying, I went to and fro in the earth, and walked up and down in it, and I saw no man as pious as Abraham. Thou didst promise him the whole land of Palestine, and yet he did not take it in ill part that he had not so much as a burial place for Sarah. As for Job, it is true, I found none that loveth thee as he does. But if thou wilt put him into my hand, I shall succeed in turning his heart away from thee. But Elohim spake, Satan, Satan, what hast thou a mind to do with my servant Job, like whom there is none in the earth? Satan persisted in his request touching Job, and Elohim granted it. He gave him full power over Job's possessions. This day of Job's accusation was the New Year's Day, whereon the good and the evil deeds of man are brought before Elohim. Job's suffering. Equipped with unlimited power, Satan endeavored to deprive Job of all he owned. He burnt part of his cattle, and the other part was carried off by enemies. What pained Job more than this was that recipients of his bounty turned against him and took of his belongings. Among the adversaries that assailed him was Lilith, the queen of Sheba. She lived at a great distance from his residence. It took her and her army 3 years to travel from her home to his. She fell upon his oxen and his asses and took possession of them, after slaying the men to whose care Job had entrusted them. One man escaped alone. Wounded and bruised, he had only enough life in him to tell Job the tale of his losses, and then he fell down dead. The sheep, which had been left unmolested by the queen of Sheba, were taken away by the Chaldeans. Job's first intention was to go to war against these marauders. But when he was told that some of his property had been consumed by fire from heaven, he desisted and said, If the heavens turn against me, I can do nothing. Dissatisfied with the result, Satan disguised himself as the king of Persia, besieged the city of Job's residence, took it, and spoke to the inhabitants, saying, This man Job hath appropriated all the goods in the world, leaving naught for others, and he hath also torn down the temple of our God. And now I will pay him back for his wicked deeds. Come with me and let us pillage his house. At first the people refused to hearken to the words of Satan. They feared that the sons and daughters of Job might rise up against them later and avenge their father's wrongs. But after Satan had pulled down the house wherein the children of Job were assembled, and they lay dead in the ruins, the people did as he bade them and sacked the house of Job. Seeing that neither the loss of all he had nor the death of his children could change his pious heart, Satan appeared before Elohim a second time and requested that Job himself, his very person, be put into his hand. Elohim granted Satan's plea, but he limited his power to Job's body. His soul he could not touch. In a sense, Satan was worse off than Job. He was in the position of the slave that had been ordered by his master to break the pitcher and not spill the wine. Satan now caused a terrific storm to burst over the house of Job. He was cast from his throne by the reverberations, and he lay upon the floor for 3 hours. Then Satan smote his body with leprosy from the sole of his foot unto his crown. This plague forced Job to leave the city and sit down outside upon an ash heap, for his lower limbs were covered with ooze and boils, and the issue flowed out upon the ashes. The upper part of his body was encrusted with dry boils, and to ease the itching they caused him, he used his nails until they dropped off together with his fingertips, and he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal. His body swarmed with vermin, but if one of the little creatures attempted to crawl away from him, he forced it back, saying, "Remain on the place whither thou wast sent, until Elohim assigns another unto thee." His wife, fearful that he would not bear his horrible suffering with steadfastness, advised him to pray to Elohim for death, that he might be sure of going hence an upright man. But he rejected her counsel, saying, "If in the days of good fortune, which usually tempts men to deny Elohim, I stood firm and did not rebel against him, surely I shall be able to remain steadfast under misfortune, which compels men to be obedient to Elohim." And Job stuck to his resolve in spite of all suffering, while his wife was not strong enough to bear her faith with resignation to the will of Elohim. Her lot was bitter indeed, for she had had to take service as a water carrier with a common churl, and when her master learned that she shared her bread with Job, he dismissed her. To keep her husband from starving, she cut off her hair and purchased bread with it. It was all she had to pay the price charged by the bread merchant, none other than Satan himself, who wanted to put her to the test. He said to her, "Hast thou not deserved this great misery of thine? It had not come upon thee." This speech was more than the poor woman could bear. Then it was that she came to her husband, and amid tears and groans urged him to renounce Elohim and die. Job, however, was not perturbed by her words, because he divined at once that Satan stood behind his wife and seduced her to speak thus. Turning to the tempter, he said, "Why dost thou not meet me frankly? Give up thy underhand ways, thou wretch." Thereupon Satan appeared before Job, admitted that he had been vanquished, and went away abashed. The four friends. The friends of Job lived in different places, at intervals of 300 miles one from the other. Nevertheless, they all were informed of their friend's misfortune at the same time in this way. Each one had the pictures of the others set in his crown, and as soon as any one of them met with reverses, it showed itself in his picture. Thus the friends of Job learned simultaneously of his misfortune, and they hastened to his assistance. The four friends were related to one another, and each one was related to Job. Eliphaz, king of Teman, was a son of Esau. Bildad, Zophar, and Eli, who were cousins. Their fathers, Shuah, Namat, and Barachel, were the sons of Buz, capital B, Uz, who was a brother of Job and a nephew of Abraham. When the four friends arrived in the city in which Job lived, the inhabitants took them outside the gates and pointing to a figure reclining upon an ash heap at some distance off, they said, "Yonder is Job." At first, the friends would not give them credence, and they decided to look more closely at the man to make sure of his identity. But the foul smell emanating from Job was so strong that they could not come near to him. They ordered their armies to scatter perfumes and aromatic substances all around. Only after this had been done for hours, they could approach the outcast close enough to recognize him. Eliphaz was the first to address Job. "Art thou indeed, Job, a king equal in rank with ourselves?" And when Job said, "Ay," they broke out into lamentations and bitter tears, and all together they sang an elegy, the armies of the three kings, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, joining in the choir. Again Eliphaz began to speak, and he bemoaned Job's sad fortune and depicted his friend's former glory, adding the refrain to each sentence, "Whither hath departed the splendor of thy throne?" After listening long to the wailing and lamenting of Eliphaz and his companions, Job spake, saying, "Silence, and I will show you my throne and the splendor of its glory. Kings will perish, rulers disappear. Their pride and luster will pass like a shadow across a mirror. But my kingdom will persist forever and ever. For glory and magnificence are in the chariot of my Father." These words aroused the wrath of Eliphaz, and he called upon his associates to abandon Job to his fate and go their way. But Bildad appeased his anger, reminding him that some allowance ought to be made for one so sorely tried as Job. Bildad put a number of questions to the sufferer in order to establish his sanity. He wanted to elicit from Job how it came about that Elohim, upon whom he continued to set his hopes, could inflict such dire suffering. Not even a king of flesh and blood would allow a guardsman of his that had served him loyally to come to grief. Bildad desired to have information from Job also concerning the movements of the heavenly bodies. Job had but one answer to make to these questions. Man cannot comprehend divine wisdom, whether it reveals itself in inanimate and brute nature or in relation to human beings. But, continued Job, to prove to you that I am in my right mind, listen to the question I shall put to you. Solid food and liquids combine inside a man, and they separate again when they leave his body. Who effects the separation? And when Bildad conceded that he could not answer the question, Job said, "If thou canst not comprehend the changes in thy body, how canst thou hope to comprehend the movements of the planets?" Zophar, after Job had spoken thus to Bildad, was convinced that his suffering had had no effect upon his mind, and he asked him whether he would permit himself to be treated by the physicians of the three kings, his friends. But Job rejected the offer, saying, "My healing and my restoration come from Elohim, the creator of all physicians." While the three kings were conversing thus with Job, his wife Zetidos made her appearance clad in rags, and she threw herself at the feet of her husband's friends. And amid tears she spoke, saying, "O Eliphaz, and ye other friends of Job, remember what I was in other days, and how I am now changed, coming before you in rags and tatters." The sight of the unhappy woman touched them so deeply that they could only weep, and not a word could they force out of their mouths. Eliphaz, however, took his royal mantle of purple and laid it about the shoulders of the poor woman. Zidithos asked only one favor, that the three kings should order their soldiers to clear away the ruins of the building under which her children lay entombed, that she might give their remains decent burial. The command was issued to the soldiers accordingly, but Job said, "Do not put yourselves to trouble for naught. My children will not be found, for they are safely restored with their Lord and Creator." Again, his friends were sure that Job was bereft of his senses. He arose, however, prayed to Elohim, and at the end of his devotions, he bade his friends look eastward. And when they did his bidding, they beheld his children next to the ruler of heaven, with crowns of glory upon their heads. Zidithos prostrated himself and said, "Now I know that my memorial resides with the Lord." As she returned to the house of her master, when she had absented herself for some time against his will, he had forbidden her to leave it, because he had feared that the three kings would take her with them. In the evening she lay down to sleep next to the manger for the cattle, but she never rose again. She died there of exhaustion. The people of the city made a great mourning for her, and the elegy composed in her honor was set down in writing and recorded. Job restored. More and more the friends of Job came to the conclusion that he had incurred divine punishment on account of his sins. And as he asseverated his innocence again and again, they prepared angrily to leave him to his fate, especially Eli, who was animated by Satan to speak scurrilous words against Job, upbraiding him for his unshakable confidence in Elohim. Then Yahuwah appeared to them, first unto Job, and revealed to him that Elihu was in the wrong, and his words were inspired by Satan. Next he appeared unto Eliphaz, and said, and to him he spake thus, "Thou and thy friends Bildad and Shofar have committed a sin, for ye did not speak the truth concerning my servant Job. Rise up and let him bring a sin offering for you. Only for his sake do I refrain from destroying you." The sacrifice offered by Job in behalf of his friends was accepted graciously by Elohim, and Eliphaz broke out into a hymn of thanksgiving to Yahuwah for having pardoned the transgression of himself and his two friends. At the same time he announced the damnation of Elihu, the instrument of Satan. Yahuwah appeared to Job once more and gave him a girdle composed of 3 ribbons, and he bade him tie it around his waist. Hardly had he put it on when all his pain disappeared. His very recollection of it vanished, and, more than this, Elohim made him to see all that ever was and all that shall ever be. After suffering 7-fold pain for 7 years, Job was restored to strength. With his 3 friends, he returned to the city, and the inhabitants made a festival in his honor and to the glory of Elohim. All his former friends joined him again, and he resumed his old occupation, the care of the poor, for which he obtained the means from the people around. He said to them, "Give me each one of you a sheep for the clothing of the poor, and 4 silver or gold drachmas for their other needs." Yahuwah blessed Job, and in a few days his wealth had increased to double the substance he had owned before misfortune overtook him. Zidithos, having died during the years of his trials, he married a second wife, Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and she bore him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had never had more than one wife at a time, for he was wont to say, if it had been intended that Adam should have 10 wives, Yahuwah would have given them to him. Only one wife was bestowed upon him, whereby Elohim indicated that he was to have but one, and therefore one wife suffices for me too. When Job, after a long and happy life, felt his end approaching, he gathered his 10 children around him and told them the tale of his days. Having finished the narrative, he admonished them in these words, See, I am about to die, and you will stand in my place. Forsake not Yahuwah, be generous toward the poor, treat the feeble with consideration, and do not marry with the women of the Gentiles. Thereupon he divided his possessions among his sons, and to his daughters he gave what is more precious than all earthly goods. To each of them 1 ribbon of the celestial girdle he had received from Yahuwah. The magic virtue of these ribbons was such that no sooner did their possessors tie them around their waist than they were transformed into higher beings, and with seraphic voices they broke out into hymns after the manner of the angels. For 3 days Job lay upon his bed, sick though not suffering, for the celestial girdle made him proof against pain. On the 4th day he saw the angels descend to fetch his soul. He arose from his bed, handed a cistern to his oldest daughter, Jemimah, day a censer to the second one, Keziah, perfume, and a cymbal to the third, Matthias, horn, and bade them welcome the angels with the sound of music. They played and sang and praised Yahuwah in the holy tongue. Then he appeared that sits in the great chariot, kissed Job, and rode away, bearing his soul with him eastward. None saw them depart except the 3 daughters of Job. The grief of the people, especially the poor, the widows, and the orphans, was exceeding great. For 3 days they left the corpse unburied, because they could not entertain the thought of separating themselves from it. As the name of Job will remain imperishable unto all time, by reason of the man's piety, so his 3 friends were recompensed by Yahuwah for their sympathy with him in his distress. Their names were preserved. The punishment of hell was remitted unto them, and best of all, Elohim poured out the Holy Spirit over them. But Satan, the cause of Job's anguish, Yahuwah cast down from heaven, for he had been vanquished by Job, who amid his agony and thanked and praised Elohim for all he had done unto him.